Good afternoon. While you all are signing in, I'm going to go ahead and welcome you to our new Knowledge Lunch series on a rainy February day. We are very lucky to have Mary Jane Umberger with HR Alliance, who is going to talk to us about human resources and the things that you need to know. I hope our Business Challenge participants are online listening to this because it will answer some of the questions that they actually had last night in our class. So without further ado, Mary Jane.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for joining us here in person and online as well. I appreciate the invitation to join you and want to talk a little bit about customer service today. But before we get started, could we go around the room and you tell me who you are and the company you're with? I'm a little hesitant to ask. In a seminar I did recently, did the same thing, asked people what brought them to the seminar, and three people from one company said, well, we were voluntold to come. So I don't know how many of you were voluntold, but I hope you're here voluntarily. Erin, would you want to start?
My name is Erin Schanzenbach. I'm a freelance bookkeeper, and I work with business owners to help keep their books in order. And the name of my business is Straighten Up.
Very good. And are you here in Abington?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm Heather Kempton with Heritage Hall in Tazewell. I'm the marketing director there, so I thought this would be good to.
Good. I hope you're not disappointed,
You
Gloria.
can travel the farthest award.
All right.
About a cookie or something. Besides our speaker.
I'm Gloria Gentry with Virginia Navigator. We're an online resource for seniors, veterans, and disabled Americans.
Very good. You go back over here and start.
My name is Amy Smith, and this is my husband Jared, and we just opened Solstice Nutrition here in the incubator at the first of the year. So we focus on nutrition education and counseling, especially for those with high levels of stress, fatigue, digestive disorders, things like that.
And they approved the cookies in moderation.
My name is Kevin Blazer, and this is my wife Jody, and we're opening up a senior transportation business.
Excellent.
My name is Lance Lovins. I'm in real estate. I'm an agent down in Charleston, South Carolina, and almost one here in Abington.
Very good. Very good.
Hey, I'm Fallon Ray. I do graphic design for Food City, and just recently started my own business on the side. Mentorship and coaching for sales.
Great.
Tanya Triplett, I work for the town of Abington.
Great. Jean, you up?
Jean Gallagher. I'm the administrative assistant here at Virginia Small Business Incubator. Welcome.
Very good. Good. And we have a videographer here that can't be seen, I guess, because she's running things. But Samantha Teeter, we're glad to have you with us, too. Thank you. Well, I have a confession to make. I am not a customer service guru. I'm counting on you for that. But I am a lifelong customer, and so I do pay attention to customer service. Perhaps like many of you, and maybe many folks in general, if I have a poor customer service experience, I tend not to say anything and just leave, dissatisfied, not to return again if I have a choice. And any of you all in that? And maybe you'll tell a few people, or maybe a few more. I was doing a leadership development series with a colleague of mine in healthcare one time, and the CEO said there are two kinds of dissatisfied customers. They're walkers and talkers. And the walkers leave, as I just described, and you never know what was wrong, nor have the opportunity to fix it. But the talkers, he described as providing you with gifts, because they do tell you what's wrong. They do allow you the opportunity to fix it and perhaps turn them into a more satisfied customer. They even had a gift board where they tracked those types of things. So I want to talk about customer service, perhaps through a little bit of an unconventional lens. I want to talk about it in a way that to see if it might apply to your organization and provide you with a framework. There are all sorts of ways, you know, that you can approach customer service, and so this is simply one, and there's a lot of material today, so I'm going to fly through it pretty quickly. So if you have any questions, suggestions, things you want to add, please don't hesitate to chime in. The first thing I'd like to do is to invite you to essentially lace up your customer shoes. I want you to, I know you're here as customer providers, but I want you to think about your experience as a customer. It could be recent, it could be a long time ago, it could be face-to-face, on the telephone, online, in your industry, outside of your industry. So take a few moments to think about a customer service experience that you have that comes to your mind immediately, or if not, a recent one. What happened this morning? What happened yesterday? What happened when you picked up lunch at McDonald's on your way here? Okay, so let me just give you a moment to do that. And when you have that, you might want to jot it down, and we'll come back to it later, okay? First wanted to introduce a very sophisticated type of customer service evaluation tool. Pretty sophisticated, huh? The peanut scale, or what I might call the Snoopy metric system for grading your customer experience. So on the oh my gosh, poor experience end of the continuum, it's kind of like, good grief, I cannot believe that experience. Or that middle where you might say, well, my expectation was met, but it was just kind of mediocre, ho-hum. Didn't impress me. We'll talk in a minute about being whelmed. Weren't overwhelmed, weren't underwhelmed. We're just whelmed. You met your expectation. And then there's that great customer service, yes, you nailed it, that tends to stick in our minds, and maybe that's one of the experiences that came to your mind. Now let's convert that to something a little more quantitative, if you will, and look at things on a 1 to 10 scale. And let's look at the poor, negative, good grief end of the spectrum as rated 0 to 4. 5 is average customer service, met your expectation. And 6 to 10 represents a very positive customer service experience. And I broke that down in 6 to 8 being a positive experience and 9 to 10 being a peak experience, an exceptional experience. And I will try to explain why in just a moment. Let me give you a couple of examples, and then we're going to actually ask you to rate your customer's experience and post it up here on our graph. So how many of you are familiar with the Fats restaurant chain? Okay. In particular, the Fats at the Dublin exit, I think it's about 98 on I-81. This has been some years ago. I was coming back, I think, from Roanoke and stopped there for a late lunch. And I was greeted by a young man who said something I'd never heard before. And it really, I did a double take. I walked in and he said, "Will you be treating yourself to lunch today?" And I said, "I beg your pardon?" He said, "Will you be treating yourself to lunch today?" And I said, "Yes." And he seated me, and I asked him if that was a script or, you know, I'd never heard that before, and it was just so delightful because what do people usually say? Yeah, just one? Like, "You poor thing, won't anyone eat with you?" And I was just so intrigued. I asked to see the manager, and she came over, and I said, "I just wanted to mention the way I was greeted." And she was like, "Oh my gosh, that's Tyler, what did he do?" And I explained, and I said, "It was just refreshing. Did you prompt him with that? Or she said, no, that was just his own creative greeting. And I said, well, it's really wonderful, and I just wanted you to know it's really little, didn't cost a dime, but how refreshing. And I know it's been years since I had that experience, and I still remember it. And she said, well, would you mind writing our corporate office or going online? There's a place you can, and if you acknowledge that, he'll get some recognition. And so I was happy to do that. So that's the other end. Where I won't really pay attention or do something positive about poor experiences, I often do pay attention to exceptional experiences and really do try to recognize them because they're so meaningful. On the other end of the spectrum, I bet you've seen these before, gotten them in the mail, often for car dealerships. There's certainly good ways to bring them on the lot, but at this particular time, I received a scratch-off sales promotion from an out-of-town car dealership who shall remain nameless. And so, although I don't always scratch them or always take the key back to try, I did this one. And lo and behold, it said I'd won an Apple iPad. Obviously, I don't have one, so I can't even pronounce what one is. And I thought, well, I think I'll go check that out. I happen to have a Subaru with over 200,000 miles. I'm kind of in the market for a car, and I went to the dealership, and they said, gave me the spiel, and I looked around, and she said, well, let me take this and go back and get your prize. And she said, I need to check your authorization number in the fine print down here. And she came back and said, you have won a replica of a gold buffalo nickel. And I was like, really? And I was so dumbfounded, I didn't even demand my Apple iPad. And I'm sure this was legal. There was a lot of fine print, but I use it every year in my ethics class because was it really ethical? It did get me on the lot. I did look at cars at a time when I was interested, but I felt duped. And so it stuck with me. Now I know that how these work. I've done the same with them locally, and so I'm a little more aware now, but it was not a positive experience. So I just tucked my tail between my legs and went home and never to return to that dealership again. So what I'd like you to do is to think of that experience, take that experience, and or another one if you have thought of it since, and if it was a poor experience, I want to invite you to take one of these red sticky notes. If it was mediocre or white, if it was an excellent experience. So for example, my FATS example to me was kind of a 9. To somebody else, it might be just ho-hum. The car experience to me was a 2. Again, to someone else, it might have been, that's fine. But if you would essentially rate your best, worst, or average experience, color code your experience with a red, green, or white mark, initial it, as I did, and then just a descriptive word. Don't need to mention the organization if you choose not to, type of organization, and then the numeric quality that represents that experience. So would you take a few minutes and do that? Those of us that are joining us online, I know you can't do that physically here, but I invite you to visualize that and join us in that exercise. And when you've done that, if you wouldn't mind just coming up here and posting it. So if it was a red 3, you might post it right here. Or if it was a green 7, you might post it over here. But if you would just take a moment to graphically display your customer service example. Anybody else want to add theirs? So you can see that we'll kind of refer to these in the future as peak experiences, and these kind of as potholes or pitfalls. And you'll see that the pits outnumbered the peaks in this particular example. Anyone care to share their example come to mind?
I went to a shoe store yesterday, and when I came in, there was no customers. There was one lady at the desk. She said hello. That was it. I walked around the shoe store for probably 15 minutes. No one ever came to ask me if I needed any help. Then I, tried on some shoes, so no one ever came over, and I finally just decided to leave since no one was going to acknowledge me. And as I left, they said, "Have a good day."
Isn't that? And what numeric rating did you give that?
I gave them a 3.
A 3.
Yeah. 'Cause
Or-
they did greet me. They just didn't care that I was there.
Yeah, interesting. Anybody else care to share their example? Yes,
So I
Sal.
went through the drive-through at McDonald's, it's been several weeks ago now, but I had forgotten to order a water.
Uh-huh.
And so when I got to the drive-through, I'm like, oh man, it's probably too late, I'm really sorry, but can I add a water to that real quickly? And they charge 35 cents nowadays, or maybe it always have, I don't know. And she said, oh yeah, we can get that for you, and didn't charge me or anything, and just was super nice the whole time. So I used to, if anybody was just extra nice, I'd go inside and ask for the manager and just say, hey, this person's doing
Good for you.
whatever they're doing well. So I went inside and asked for the manager. And at first I was joking around. I was like, I just want to lodge a formal complaint. But then just your drive-through attendant's super nice, super helpful, and I really appreciate it. And that made his day, the manager too, because he said, people want to talk to me. It's almost always negative. Hardly anybody comes in and says anything positive. So thank you very much. And he gave me info about how to, pass that information along in a way that would help her.
Good.
It made her day, and now every time that I go through the drive-through and she's working there, and she often is, I just say, hey, and we chat for a second, and she's super cool. I get to know her a little bit, so she's just a real nice lady.
Wonderful. So you not only acknowledge their customer service and its exceptional resonance with you, but also you probably helped employee engagement and just positive reinforcement in the workplace. So, wonderful. Anybody else care to share their experience?
We're moved to the area. We're having our internet installed in our home. I guess the other day, 2 days ago. Anyway, last time we experienced some issues with it, so we had to get on the phone. My wife called them and spent 45 minutes or so on the phone with them to try to go through, jump through all the hoops in order to fix things. It wasn't possible, and then they came out first thing this morning to correct the issue, which they did. They knew exactly what the problem was, and were able to correct things with no problem at all. So both her experience on the phone was positive, but they did try a lot of different things to help us out from a remote area.
Mm-hmm.
And then the person that came out was super helpful and very, very nice. Even took the shoes off so we wouldn't track them through the house.
Really?
So it was
Nice.
a very good experience.
Great.
And giving them a 9.
A 9. What was the numeric you gave?
8.75.
Okay. That's another workshop. We'll talk about that. Okay, did you have an example?
Yeah, this has been probably 13 or 14 years ago, and we used to live in Kingsport. I was raised there. My mom was disabled and had a lot of heart issues and health issues, so we were taking her. We didn't know how much time we had left with her, and she had wanted to go to this particular restaurant for Mother's Day, and so we went on Saturday, not on Mother's Day because we knew it would be super busy. And when we went in, we just told how many people we had in our party, and the manager very rudely asked me, the owner, not the manager, the owner, very rudely asked me if we had reservations, and I didn't realize that we had to have reservations. If we do, then we'll just bring her back another day. And he was just very rude and said, well, evidently you don't know how important I am. And
Oh my goodness.
how popular this restaurant is, and I said, no, I wasn't aware of, I knew that she wanted to come, and so he ended up finding us a table, but he sat us outside on a patio with a live fan, and we couldn't even talk to one another, and we never went back to that place.
And how long ago did you say that was?
Probably 13 or 14 years
Isn't it amazing how the peaks and the pits and the potholes really do stick with you and influence your purchasing decisions and how you share those things with other folks. So, interesting. A 1. Well, that was kind of you. They did seat you. They did at least seat you. Okay.
Well, the waitress was nice.
Oh, good, good. Okay.
I don't think there's a number low enough for mine.
Oh, dear.
I moved, and the internet provider I had did not service the new area I moved into. Well, so anyway, that was in September that I moved to my new location, and I'm still fighting with that internet company to get the overpayment that I didn't know when you called to disconnect your service that you had to disconnect the auto pay too.
Huh.
But
No one bothered to mention that.
and this is very, very fresh in my mind because this was yesterday that I had another call with them. And it's not resolved. I have talked to several people. I told my bank, do not do any more, but she told me that she would get that. Well, that stopped, but I'm still waiting on my refund.
So, just a comment, in anything that has that is controlled by the FCC, they have to pay towns and counties for operating in their communities. So a formal complaint to the town or county that you live in might get some results.
Good suggestion.
Well, I lived in the county, in Washington County, and I moved to West Virginia. So Washington County.
Or you could talk to the folks that helped you.
Well, I have internet, and it's perfect where I am.
Okay.
But
And you gave them, was 0 as low as you could go since we didn't have a sub-zero?
I was very nice. I rated it
A 2.
Yeah,
Okay.
but I could have rated it -10.
Okay.
Because nobody wanted to help me. And she wouldn't even take my new address to mail my refund to. She said, they'll call you back. I'm going to process it. I'll probably never hear from them again, and I'll have to do it all over again.
Isn't it amazing? Just like the situation you encountered at the restaurant where it really doesn't cost anything so often, 1, to be kind, and 2, to accommodate people and come out smelling like a rose, as opposed to begrudgingly helping them and leaving a negative impression forever. So, interesting. Anyone else care to share? Thank you for those examples. How many of you actually quantitatively rate customer service? Anyone? Do you all? Are you familiar with Net Promoter Score and how to do that? Let me just run through this. I was not until recently, and one of my clients actually does external NPS scores, and they've started doing internal between, like their engineering department said, we want to know what kind of service our customers internally perceive that we're providing. And I found this really enlightening. Again, it's on a 0 to 10 scale, and although there are variables around it, there's really just one question. How likely are you to recommend our organization to another? When I did this workshop in an open forum, we closed with, how likely are you to recommend this workshop to another? Because I wanted to know what the NPS score was. And so you'll notice that 0 through 6, they call detractors. So even 5 to 6, they're saying has a negative connotation. They call 7 and 8 passive, which I thought was enlightening, and 9 and 10 are called promoters. And so you're asked to rate that from very unlikely to very likely. And let's say in an example, 48% of your respondents gave you a 7 or 8. And many of us would be happy with a 7 or 8, wouldn't we? And maybe 24% were promoters. So you can see the majority rated in this example 7 or more, and only 28% as detractors. But the calculation for MPS is the percentage of promoters less the percentage of detractors, and it does not even count the passive. They consider that kind of ho-hum. So the net promoter score in this example is actually -4. Is that your understanding of how you run MPS?
We both used to work in hospitality and use the same.
Did you?
thing.
Okay.
That's also too, like if you go to somewhere they say, oh, they circle the survey at the bottom, they'll often write a 10 next to it so that when you go fill out the survey online or on the phone, you give them a 10 because, like you said, the 7 and 8 doesn't even mean anything.
Right, right. So just kind of another quantitative way to look at how your customer perceives your service. And their perception represents your reality, whether it's true or not, isn't it? So let's shift to the reason we're here, to talk about customer service from a customer service provider. When I heard you talking about carrying your keys and you sounded like a janitor, I was reminded of an example somebody mentioned one time at Wake Forest Hospital. There was this big old burly janitor that was nothing big and burly about you, just to clarify. No. But had all those keys on his side and was jingling around, mopping the floors in this particular wing, and there was a patient in the hallway waiting to be placed in a room. And he went over to the patient and said, "Need anything?" And the patient said, "Well, you know, I'm actually kind of cold. Is there any way you could get me a blanket?" He said, "Sure, wait here." So he went to, one of those little warmers that have the thin, warm blankets, brought one back, laid it gently over it, tucked him in, said, "Need anything else?" He said, "No, thank you. This just makes all the difference." Was that janitor a customer service representative? Yes. In every sense of the word but his title, if even that was relevant. And so I want to talk about customer service in that context. I mentioned kind of an unconventional means by which of going about this, and I don't know, are there any of you who have read The Power of Moments by the Heath brothers, Chip and Dan Heath? They have written 4 Times bestsellers. The one before this, I think, was Switch, about change management. The 3 guys that were voluntold to come to that seminar was on Switch. But The Power of Moments talks about customer service in a context that I had never heard before, and it was really thought-provoking to me. Chip Heath on the left is on the West Coast, works with Stanford and does a lot of research with them. Dan Heath is on the East Coast, works with Duke, and does a lot of research, and then they've collaborated on a number of books. And I think Dan Heath may have written one by himself just now. But that is the context for which I'd like to spend the rest of our time together, and kind of invite you to think outside the mason jar, so to speak. What they describe in The Power of Moments are moments being peak moments or defining moments. Moments that are short experiences that are both meaningful and memorable. Will you be, can't even remember now, but will you be treating yourself to lunch today? Certainly was a short experience, meaningful and memorable. It typically evokes joy and strategic surprise. So I was surprised when I heard that, but when you have strategic surprise, it's really consistent with the mission, vision, and values of your organization. It's intentional in that respect. It can be unexpected, it can be random. So that's kind of what The Power of Moments describes. And what I thought we'd do, there are a number of clips on YouTube, and I invite you to take a look, because they're certainly much more better portraying this than I. Let's just take a few minutes and listen to this overview, if we may.
There's a puzzle about our memories of experiences let's call it the Disney paradox. And if you've been to one of the Disney theme parks, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. If we were to sample your happiness level at, say, a couple of dozen different moments over the course of your park visit, my guess is that in a majority of those moments, you would actually be happier sitting on your couch at home. It's less humid there, less crowded. You can get a hot dog for less than $10. But as we reflect on our park visit, it might be one of the highlights of the year. Why is that? Well, psychologists know that our memories of our experiences are not really fair. And we don't just take an average of our moment-by-moment sensations when we reflect on our experiences. Rather, we remember snippets, scenes, moments. And in particular, there are two moments that we disproportionately remember. The peak of the experience, which is either the best or the worst moment, and the ending. So when we look back on Disney, we tend to remember the roller coaster moments, the sweet family moments, the surprises. But we don't recall that moment-to-moment sweatiness and irritability. Now, when we talk about creating better experiences for the people we care about, whether that's our customers, our patients, our students, or our kids, what this means is that we're really talking about creating better moments. Great experiences hinge on peak moments. But there's a problem, because we're not trained to build peak moments. We're trained to fix problems. We think that to create better experiences, we take a survey and we collect all the complaints and criticisms and we fix those things. But fixing problems doesn't make people happy. Fixing problems whelms people. Not overwhelms, not underwhelms, whelms. If you drive down a stretch of the road with no potholes at all, you're not ecstatic, you're whelmed. If your cable TV functions exactly as it's supposed to, you're not happy, you're whelmed. So if this is the reaction that we want from people, we need to start building peaks. Let me give you an example. There's a hotel in Los Angeles called the Magic Castle. You're seeing scenes of it here. It's not a lot to look at, is it? The amenities aren't that great. Would you be surprised if I told you this is the #2 rated hotel in Los Angeles based on thousands of reviews on TripAdvisor? How could that be true? There's a phone by the pool, it's cherry red. You pick up the handset, you hold it up to your ear. Someone answers and says, "Popsicle hotline, may I help you?" You can order up grape or cherry or orange popsicles delivered to you at poolside by someone on a silver tray wearing gloves like an English butler. All for free. There's a snack menu where you can get Cheetos and Cracker Jacks and cream soda all for free, just for asking. There's a board game menu. There's a movie menu allowing you to check out things for free. There are magicians doing tricks in the lobby in the mornings. You can even drop off your laundry. They'll have it done, washed, and folded by the end of the day. And now you're starting to get a feel for how this unassuming place could be the #2 hotel in LA. Just ahead of, you see that? The Four Seasons Beverly Hills. What this teaches us is something so important. Great service experiences are mostly forgettable and occasionally remarkable. People are willing to forget a lot of average, a lot of mediocrity, as long as there are some moments that are special. But those moments don't create themselves. And if we don't invest in those remarkable moments, look at what we're left with. If we want to improve the experiences people have, we've got to stop fixing potholes and start building peaks.
So what do you think?
I'm in.
You're in? Well, let's talk a little bit more about that and see if that framework has any applicability to your business. He talked about peak experiences and end experiences, coincidentally known as the peak end rule. He also talks about beginnings and how those represent transitions, where you end something and you begin something else. Some of the research that they did, they went to college campuses or looked at students who had recently graduated. And they talked about primarily things that happened in September when they started school, when they moved in, the friendships they started to build. And graduation, when they ended that career. And then an occasional peak in their experience. But certainly, as Dan Heath suggested, not the chronological review of events in an effort to have an average experience. So I think that's kind of insightful, because how many of us I know I have done it in organizations where I've taken the survey to see how people are satisfied, what the problems are, tried to fix the problems. And so we'll talk a little more about that process in a moment. But as far as a beginning, one of the examples in The Power of Moments, he talks about John Deere and their onboarding and orientation program. That's very intentional. They send a welcoming offer letter when someone is employed with their organization. And then that person, before they even starts, gets an email from a colleague. And then there's a welcome message on a flat screen TV when they walk into their place of business on the first day. And then they're greeted by that colleague that sent them an email before they even began. There's a banner at their workstation, because they're in a culture and where people see that, they know to stop by and introduce themselves and welcome people, answer any questions. And there's a gift on their desk where they start work, and I think it's a John Deere plow replica that started the business. And so it's very meaningful to people that work with John Deere. They open up their computer, and in their inbox there's a message from Sam Allen, the CEO, who says, "Welcome to the most important work you'll ever do." And then there's an off-site lunch with colleagues, and there's a scheduled lunch with the boss's boss a few weeks later. So they're very intentional about how they bring someone into their culture and orient them. Now you might think that this must be implemented around the world in all John Deere sites. And interestingly, perhaps not surprisingly, it's not. Someone said in their Beijing office, "Could we quit and come back so we could experience this?" Because they said, we don't do that here. The reason being, there seldom are peak experience officers in a organization. So it takes some real intention to implement something like this and then consistently use it, upgrade it, improve it, to make it really an integrated part of an organization's culture. So it's easier said than done, but for those who invest in doing it, they've had really beneficial returns on that investment. Lower turnover, higher employee engagement, so forth. Then there's the story of Joshie Hearn, and you may have seen this online. Have you ever heard about Joshie the giraffe? And a gentleman named Chris Hearn is the CEO with a financial company down in Florida. He had a business meeting, so his wife and 2 children went to the RitzCarlton on Amelia Island and spent a few days while he was working. And when they got back home, they realized that their youngest son had left his stuffed giraffe at the Ritz-Carlton, and he was inconsolable. And so his dad said, "Look, I tell you what, I'll call tomorrow. I bet Joshie just stayed over for a few more days of vacation and will be home lickety-split." And so the son seemed to buy that. The next morning, the dad called the Ritz and told him the dilemma and said, what he told his son, and asked if he could help him out. And he said, "If you could find Joshie, that'd be great. And if it wouldn't be too much extra trouble, could you just take a picture of him by the pool so that you won't make me look like the liar that I am in what I told my son last night?" And they said, "Sure, we'll take a look." A couple days later, a package arrived, and it was from the Ritz-Carlton. And there was a laminated tag from the Ritz that said, "Joshie Hearn, loss prevention." This happened back in 2012. And just as the dad had asked, there was a picture of Joshie lounging by the pool. But this staff had gone a couple steps further. They actually made a photo album, and here was Joshy with some of his other friends, and here's Amelia the parrot, probably why he missed the ride home in the first place. And here he is patrolling the beach, and here he is getting a massage, and here he is working in the loss prevention room. Do you think that was a peak experience for the Hearns? You think they'll remember that? Not only the fact that it went viral and millions of people have seen it, that's where I got these pictures online. The Hearns, certainly it influenced them as a family, and the CEO of this company will likely remember that and share that. So the return on the investment of however long it took for that creative loss prevention employee to find Joshy, take these pictures, put it in a notebook and send it to the Hearns, had some immeasurable meaning. Let's talk about quantitatively building peaks and fixing potholes. If this was your organization and you were to say, okay, we got a survey back and here is the distribution of customer perceptions, what percent, irrelevant of the number of those, what perception do you think you spend, what percentage do you spend building peaks versus fixing potholes? Any thoughts, just random, how you think that your 100% of time might be distributed between these two buckets?
I would say fixing potholes demands a lot more time than the small amount of time it takes to significantly increase.
Okay. Any thoughts on a percentage?
Mary Jane, we just had someone that's broadcasting this live at the Ospo Center.
Good.
That said, ask if we don't have a microphone to pass around, so they ask if you would repeat the answer because they can't hear the question.
Certainly. Thank you. Good suggestion. If you had to give it a numeric.
I would say 70%.
70% on fixing potholes versus 30% building peaks. Anyone else? Any thoughts? Does that kind of represent? Yes.
Yes, and maybe there's something I'm not seeing correctly as well, throw this out there. If that's true, that because there's more potholes than opportunities or time for other things, then it seems like that might be another reason to build peaks if they don't take that long, where you've got a chance.
Point well taken. So if you could invest here, perhaps you'd have less of this. Is that what you're suggesting? Or
Maybe it would overshadow that in either way.
good point, and great segue, because the research that they did was real close to your thoughts, that it was about 80-20 in terms of how we invest our time. So if you spent an hour fixing potholes, that meant about 15 minutes working on peaks. And makes sense to me, and not to suggest that we can ignore this. If you have a payroll issue, a safety issue, a healthcare issue, a procedural issue, it can't be ignored because you want to go work on peak experiences. But I think the questions that the author poses, is there opportunity to maybe redistribute that time? And I think this was probably the most meaningful quantitative insight from this book to me, to those who are bottom line thinkers or CFOs or CEOs that say, well, what's the return on investment of time fixing potholes versus building peaks? And their research showed that for every hour fixing a pothole, it was about $1 in revenue. But that 15 minutes was worth about $9 in revenue. So essentially you're spending 4 times more time chasing 1/9 of the revenue. Again, you can't ignore this, but maybe rather than 80-20, could it be 70-20 or 60-40 or something closer to, so that those potholes get addressed, but the peaks get magnified, and perfection isn't then maybe the ultimate objective if the Heath brothers are correct in terms of their studies. Let me give you a couple of quick examples, see if we can keep on track here. You might want to Google Doug Dietz and his TED Talk with GE Healthcare. It's a lovely 19-minute clip that I will give you in less than 2 minutes. Doug Dietz was actually an engineer in GE's healthcare division, and he was working with a number of his colleagues on a new imaging machine, a new MRI, to improve the quality of the images that were being taken in a pediatric environment. And so he was so excited when this went online that he kind of stood in the hallway behind a corner to watch as the families came in to have this experience. And he was horrified as he found a child that saw it, froze, and started to cry because it was so intimidating. And Doug Dietz said he was heartbroken, that he realized that while technically this was state of the art, his customer, the children that were actually being served by it, were intimidated. So he went back to the drawing board, met with some colleagues, and made a very kid-friendly MRI, which is present in some of I think this is from Pittsburgh Hospital, some of the major pediatric hospitals around the country. I was actually surprised. I have some friends that work at St. Jude's in Memphis, and I sent them this TED Talk, and I said, you probably have an environment like this. And they said, no, we don't, but we want to look at that. Because what they found is not only was it a more pleasant experience for children, is that sedation rates went from 80% in this environment to 27% in this environment. So less stress on kids and parents, more efficiency in getting people through because there wasn't as much time. And I think the piece de resistance for Doug Dietz was one time he was talking with a mom, and the child kept kind of pulling on her skirt and said, Mom, Mom, and interrupting, and finally she said, yes, what is it? She said, can we come back tomorrow? Great TED Talk. Then there was Wendy. She was at a hospital in Vermont, and she had a rare heart condition and had been in the hospital for months. And Wendy loved the snow, and but water intake was very sensitive to her condition. So it started to snow, and of course she really wanted to build a snowman. And so a couple of nurses put their heads together. They went out, they got a big bowl of snow. What's a child do the first time they are encountered with snow? Eat it. They want to eat it, right? So they measured it, they melted it, they measured it again. They learned how much they could get without putting her in any health jeopardy, went out and got some more snow and brought it in. Now she couldn't go outside and make a snowman, but she could certainly experience snow in her hospital room. I think that was a peak moment for she and her family. You betcha. There are a number throughout the book of various industries, perhaps not some that we have represented here, but perhaps applicable situations. In banking and finance, they talk about a Wells Fargo Citibank that has developed a transition team so that when employees have special transitions in their life, they try to recognize that in some way or another. So if a child comes in and they want to open their first account and they have $13, they might say, could we add 7 and make it 20? And can you imagine what that means to a child who's spent however long to raise $13? Or to someone who's bought their first home. They don't use the same principle there, but they do maybe write them a congratulatory letter that is their first home. Various transitions in their life, even to if an employee, if a customer experiences, say, a divorce or a loss of a spouse, they put a pause on their mortgage for 3 months. They're still going to get that money, but they realize that that's really a significant emotional event in someone's life, and they could use a break. There's a bank in New Zealand that has actually come up with a grief team that rather than if someone loses their spouse and they come into the bank to try to get all the affairs in orders, and of course they don't have everything they need and they have to come back again and probably again. And this team now goes to the home of the widow or widower, right there where all the bills and the financial records are, and sit down in the comfort of that individual's home. And they've found that that has made a wonderful difference in the lives of their customers, and that there are also people that say, I'd like a rotation on the grief support team. They've done a lot of research around Southwest Airlines. Apparently they have a really sophisticated analytics team, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but well, let me set the stage. Some of the research they did indicated that on 1.5% of Southwest Airlines flights, they used humorous flight announcements when they, what are they called when they do the safety announcements, when you get on the plane and you know where the exits are and so on and so forth. And then what they found was that on those flights, that those passengers tended to fly an average of a half a flight more in the subsequent year. Now that's statistically speaking, you know they're not going to stop halfway. But they track that. So they said, well, let's double that. Let's try 3%. And that yielded $138 million in additional revenue. And so while this example isn't in the book, I thought it was fun and you might enjoy seeing it. How many of you have flown Southwest? Okay, I've never flown Southwest. How many have flown United? Okay, we're going to talk about United and American in a moment. But
good evening, folks. Welcome aboard Southwest Airlines Flight 372, service to Oklahoma City. Those of you that have flown us before know that we do things a little bit differently in our Southwest. Some of us tell jokes, some of us sing, some of us just stand there and look beautiful. I, unfortunately, can do none of those. So here's the one thing that I do know how to do. We're going to shake things up a little bit. I need a little audience participation. Otherwise, this is not going to go over well at all. So here's what I need, especially you guys in front because you know what's coming. All right, I need a beat. All right? All I need you to do is stomp and clap, and I'm going to do the rest because I've had 5 flights today, and I just cannot do the regular boring announcement again. Otherwise, I'm going to put myself to sleep. So, you guys with me? All right. So, it's going to be a stomp, clap, clap. Come on, stomp, clap, clap. They don't be there. There you go. Keep that going. This is right. 372 on SWA. The flight attendants on board serving you today. Teresa in the middle. David in the back. My name is David, and I'm here to tell you that. Shortly after takeoff, first things first, there's soft drinks and coffee to quench your thirst. But if you want another kind of drink, then just holler. Alcohol beverages will be $4. If a Monster energy drink is your plan, that'll be $3, and you get the whole can. We won't take your cash, you gotta pay with plastic. If you have a coupon, then that's fantastic. We know you're ready to get the new places. Open up the bin, put away your suitcases. Carry on out and go under the seat in front of you, so none of you have things by your feet. If you have a seat on the road with the exit, I'm gonna talk to you, so you might as well accept it. You gotta help evaluate in case we need you. If you don't want to, then we're gonna reset you. Before we leave, our advice is put away your electronic devices. Fasten your seatbelt, then put your trays up. Press the button to make the seat back raise up. Sit back, relax, have a good time. It's almost time to go, so I'm done with the rhyme. Thank you for the fact that I wasn't ignored. This is Southwest Airlines. Welcome aboard. Thank you very much for my beat. I appreciate that. You will not get that on United Airlines, I guarantee you.
We had a similar kind of situation. We went on Princess Cruise Line, and when they do the muster drill, it's all to the, what's the song?
Oh, the Love Boat.
The Love Boat.
Oh, really?
Song, yeah.
And a little more memorable, isn't it? Breaks for people who fly a lot, you saw some what are apparently corporate executives in the front. They probably heard that flight announcement, 20 times in a month, so they're not paying attention, but he got them engaged and people having a good time. Didn't take a lot of, they talk about how their headquarters in Dallas, Texas, they just have an environment that kind of promotes this type of thing. And as I mentioned, it leads to about $138 million in revenue just in that one area, which I thought was pretty interesting. I'm a little more familiar with United. I too have, just because of where I would typically fly. I've not flown Southwest, although I may now, but I have United and some of its precursors. Has anyone ever heard the story of United breaks guitars? Yes? Did I heard that? Then you know that this is Dave Carroll. He had a $300 Taylor guitar, and he was flying from one location to another, and it was mishandled in the process. He was not happy.
They wouldn't let him keep it on the plane.
Was that it? They wouldn't let him?
Yeah, I think he asked to keep it with him.
I see. And they had to put it in the belly of the plane. And then he looked out the window and saw how they were mishandling it. The reason I know that is because he wrote a song about it, and it went live. And because he really wasn't able to get any satisfaction, you can relate, can't you, because of your experience, in somebody doing something about repairing or replacing his Taylor guitar. And actually, I think it's a number of songs now. He mentions customer service reps by name. He's written a book. I mean, it has been an amazing viral experience. And I saw this and I thought it was interesting and a lesson in terms of what poor customer service can do. It used to be a cost associated with poor customer service experience back in the day when we didn't have social media. They would say, on average, people tell 9 to 10 people, and the cost of that is such and such. You know how it's exploded with social media, and this is one example. United, one of the largest international airlines in the U.S., with 50,000 employees and more than 3,300 flights per day. Dave Carroll's a professional guitarist and a member of the band Sons of Maxwell from Canada. He undergoes this very bad experience with United. They roughly handle his guitar and causes damage. Customer complaint was not handled properly. Makes the song United Breaks Guitars, which talks about his bad experience and frustration. Here's the bottom line. United Breaks Guitars effect reaches 100 million people. That's when this graphic was done. I'm sure it's more now. And it increases in popularity. United Breaks Guitar effect, stocks plunged 10%, creating a loss of $180 million to the shareholders. Now, certainly there were probably other things that contributed to that, but it is amazing, as you can see, the attention this one customer experience had on this customer and on United Airlines and their shareholders. So he even writes a song, I think, and apologizes to one of the customer service reps who had told him, no, sorry, we can't do anything, because he acknowledges she was probably following their standard operating procedure, but I'm sure it gave him an opportunity to rethink that.
19 million views.
19 million views, on that particular one. Well, I want to close talking about what the Heath brothers call how you build peak moments. And if you want to take one of these and pass it along, you'll have a hard copy of that. But they use the acronym EPIC for elevation, pride, insight, and connection. But they also acknowledge that they only use that once to help your memory. And they make a point by saying, building peak moments do not have to be epic. Will you be treating yourself for lunch today? You know, that's not epic. It didn't cost anything, but it made a significant impression. So they talk about each of these, and I think there's some definition. Elevation are experiences that rise above the routine, that make us feel engaged, joyful, surprised, motivated, that they actually elevate our spirit, make us feel better. And some of you have expressed experiences you've had that have done that. Pride, it commemorates people's achievements. For example, when you went in and acknowledged the McDonald's experience you had to an employee or to a manager and then to the employee, it created some pride, I'm sure, within that employee and maybe in yourself even for having done that. It provides insight often. It will deliver realizations and transformations, and or it creates connection. It bonds us together. Groups unite when they struggle together toward a meaningful goal. So every peak may not satisfy each of those, but they do outline one in the book that does. And again, it involves Southwest Airlines. I thought this was a touching example. I'd not heard of this ever being done on an airline, but when they had reached cruising altitude, the flight attendant came on the announcement and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a newlywed couple on board with us today. John and Leslie, will you raise your hand? Let everyone know." And the whole plane applauded. And I thought, what a lovely gesture. Didn't cost anything. Just took a little bit of creativity and a little bit of chutzpah to do that. But they didn't stop there. They said, if you'd like to share a few words of encouragement or wisdom for a strong marriage, just hit your call button and we'll pass out some napkins so you can write them down. This will be our plane's wedding gift to them. And I thought, oh my gosh, and lo and behold, about half the people hit their call button and started writing things down that they'd noticed in their marriage, or maybe they've observed in their parents, or maybe where their marriage had gone astray and had not had a happy ending, or all sorts of things. And so then they had the opportunity to connect, not only with that couple, but maybe with their seatmate, as they talked about, well, what about you? Did you ever have an experience like that? And I think that's about the most lovely gesture I've heard in terms of airline travel. And did it not satisfy each of those peak moments? It elevated the couple, not to mention the crew and the passengers. It created some pride on the behalf of those that said, well, I hadn't thought of that, but this is what my wife and I do, or my husband and I do, that makes us a strong marriage that I'd like to share with this couple that I don't even know. It provides some insight and introspection as they were thinking about that very assignment, and certainly created a connection within that 747 with seatmates, with this couple, with the crew. So I thought that was pretty epic myself, and I thought it was an interesting example of and a tribute to Southwest Airlines. So let me close with this. And if we were doing a workshop, we would spend the rest of our time allowing you to collaborate with each other. But one, we're kind of restrained by time, and we have an online audience that would be left out of that collaborative process. So we're not going to do that today. But let me share some things that will allow you to go back to work and do that if you so choose. Let me preface that with a survey that I saw that was done by LinkedIn. Familiar with LinkedIn? Apparently about 250 million active users and more than twice that many members. And they did a survey last year about what were the top 10 most critical hard skills and soft skills for employees today. And I was so intrigued by the most in-demand soft skill for last year, which was just a couple months ago. Anybody want to guess what that might? I would have never guessed. Anybody want to guess what that might be? Communication? Okay, good question. A soft skill, I think, is more the art of leadership, involves how we interact with people, emotional intelligence, whereas hard skills are more technically oriented, more standard operating procedure oriented. Although I heard a colleague once tell me that the soft skills are really hard skills because they're not the science, they're the art that exists in human resources, in leadership, in employee engagement. Anybody else want to guess? And I bet those things were on the list.
I kind of hope that it is some form, I don't know how to say it, but like just how to uplift people and make them feel like they're doing a good job.
Okay, so how to praise people, and there's certainly books that have written. Have you seen the book that's based on the 5 languages of love? There's a book now called The 5 Languages of Appreciation in the Workplace. So to your point, very, very important. Lo and behold, it was creativity. And I thought, think of the examples we've talked about today and how much creativity was at play. Turning an MRI into a child's playground, creating a snowman opportunity for a child who's ill. And very, again, I go back to my FATS experience. It was just the creativity of Tyler to say, will you be treating yourself to lunch today? So I thought that was really powerful. So your mission, should you choose to accept it, that ages me, doesn't it? Does anybody know where that comes from? Enough. Okay, thank you. Your homework, you're invited to flex your creative muscles and unleash your creative genius when you return to work. And what I'm suggesting is that you take some time to brainstorm ideas for creating peak customer experiences, that is, moments that matter in your organization, remembering that moments that matter are peak moments or short experiences that are both meaningful and memorable. And look at the language of brainstorming. Good thinking. Have you ever considered, I have an idea, yes, and, what about, yeah, and, but not shutting down ideas at all. I'm sure you've seen some of the, quote, rules for brainstorming and your way to creative outcomes. You encourage wild ideas from everyone. You defer judgment. All ideas are welcome. It's quantity over quality. You build on the ideas of others, and you stay on topic. In this example, generating ideas for creating peak customer experiences, moments that matter. I had this conversation where we did have a little more time with the audience, and it was a Parks and Recreation group. And I happened to know that they had just refurbished their indoor pool. They had cleaned it, they'd taken the water out, they'd painted it, they'd, I'm sure, done a lot of other things to optimize the system. And I said, well, what about if maybe a peak experience would be to have a slime festival, and you would fill the pool with lime jello and create, and of course, how can you imagine everybody, of course not, we could never do that. And I said, yeah, of course, I know that, but we're just brainstorming. And who knows but what that idea might say, well, of course we can't do that, but gosh, maybe we could have a slime festival if that's what you wanted to do in another context with other resources that really might draw children in or adults in to use our facility. Somebody else suggested, I thought this was a great idea. I need to follow up and see if they've done it, although I wouldn't go. But in their poll, they said, we've thought about showing movies at night in the pool, and then people could have flotation devices, so they could have a noodle or a raft or an inner tube or whatever, just lounge in the pool and watch the movie. And I thought, what a cool idea. And they said, what we were thinking about showing first would be Jaws. Can you imagine? I thought, what a creative example. Again, I wouldn't go, but what an experience for somebody that wanted to experience that. So, again, moments that create elevation, pride, insight, connection. There's some challenges to your homework assignment. There'd be challenges if we were doing it here. There'd be challenges if you go back to work and you try to engage other employees. First, selling the concept of building peaks to someone who's not with you today, someone who hasn't read The Power of Moments, someone thinks that, well, that's poppycock. We've got these problems, we need to fix these. We do not have time to spend on peak experience. That's a challenge. You become a marketeer. You have to sell that concept. Next is brainstorming that is easier than implementation, isn't it? Brainstorming is kind of fun, but then honing that down onto an idea and implementing that idea is really a challenge. Take John Deere, for example, who were very successful in the areas where they had implemented and stayed with it and been very intentional, but not so much where that implementation did not take place. And the last that the Heath brothers warn about, beware of the soul-sucking force of reasonableness. They talk about the Magic Castle Hotel. And someone said, well, why don't you just put a cooler with popsicles and say, help yourself, one's free. And you could. But is that a different experience than picking up the phone, ordering one, and having a butler bring it on a silver tray while you're still in the pool? Night and day, is it not? So he says, beware of the soul-sucking force of reasonableness. Having a slime fest in a newly regenerated or even an old pool, not a good idea. But maybe there's some variation on that that is different than mundane that would really create a peak experience. The benefit of that is the unlimited return on investment potential that exists from those peak experiences. We talked about Southwest Airlines going from 1.5% humorous flight announcements to 3% and making $138 million. A lot of ROI for people who know how important that is to maintaining a business. Customer loyalty, retention, new customer potential, employee engagement, increased bottom line opportunities. So that's my story. I'm sticking with it. It's really not my story. It's the story of the Heath brothers that really just struck a chord for me in terms of customer service in a way that I had not heard it before and thought it made sense. Perhaps not easy to implement, but certainly fun to consider and set yourself apart from organizations who don't have that understanding or belief or even that drive to be an organization that can provide peak cares. So I want to thank you for picturing service through a rather unconventional lens, and I wish you well in creating moments that matter in your organization. And thank you. I know I have done most of the talking, and I've talked nonstop and haven't given you a lot of opportunity. Any comments or observations, something hit you, strike you one way than another? Any thoughts?
My thought is this was an excellent presentation, and we certainly appreciate you coming all the way down here to help us out with our new knowledge.
Well, my pleasure. What a nice benefit, is it not, for not only for people to walk in here and take advantage of free entertainment, but those online who can just plug in. So thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you. So next week, or in 2 weeks, February the 19th, we are going to have what social media platforms is best for my business. This is our last opportunity to hear from Cindy Hagman. Her husband accepted a job in the Midwest, and they are moving, and I've been crying ever since. But be sure and come to the next New Knowledge, Miss Cindy Hagman. Thank you.
Thank you.